He got caught watching the beautiful Apache girl change by the river. Then she walked up, and before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The land was bare and dry. No birdsong, no wind through the trees. Just brittle grass, snapping underfoot, and the distant trickle of a narrow, half-frozen river. The sky was the color of burned tin, cloudless, heavy. Not snow yet, but close. Harlan Tate squatted near the edge of the fire ring he'd built 3 weeks earlier when he first set up camp along the forgotten bend of the Verde River. He was stirring a dented tin pot of beans with a pocket knife, his other hand resting on his knee. His rifle, a battered Henry .44, lay across a rolled-up saddle blanket within reach. Even though no one had come through this part of the valley in days, he liked it that way. Harlan was 38 years old, and every year of it showed on his face. The scars on his knuckles and jaw were reminders of bad orders, frostbite, and fights he never started. He'd been a scout in the Union Army during the final years of the war and stayed on after as a tracker, working for officers who didn't remember his name but trusted his eyes. That job dried up like the riverbeds, and he'd wandered south, trapping mules and avoiding towns. He hadn't spoken to another person in 2.5 weeks. In one saying came out this far, unless they were running from something. He stood slowly, brushing off his knees, and moved toward the river with an empty canteen and the tin cup he used for coffee. He stepped over dry roots and sun-bleached bones. The air smelled like wood smoke and creosote. Cold clung low to the ground. That's when he saw her. She was standing in shallow water near the bend, ankle deep, still half turned away. Her dress was Apache-made, leather with beadwork and frayed seams, tore along one side beneath her ribs. Her shoulders were bare, the thin strap of her dress sliding down her arm as she rinsed something under the surface, maybe fabric, maybe her own hair. She was young, mid-20s maybe, dark-haired her lower back, straight and wet, clinging to her skin. Harlan stopped where he was, 20 feet away. His heart kicked up hard in his chest. Not desire, not right away. First, it was instinct. Don't move. Don't speak. Don't spook her. He didn't even raise his rifle. He watched her silently, thinking, she doesn't belong here either. She was barefoot, shivering a little in the wind, but not in distress. Her hands moved with control. She looked like she'd been alone a long time. Harlan's eyes flicked down the trail behind her. No horses, no packs, no one else. His jaw tightened. A lone Apache woman, this far from the tribal routes. No escort, no supplies. That didn't happen by choice. He shifted, the edge of his boot crunching on gravel. Her head turned. Their eyes met, his gut clenched. He didn't raise his hands, but he didn't move forward either. Her face didn't change. She didn't cover herself, didn't speak, just watched him. Harlan felt his throat go dry. He took one step back, not in fear, but as a gesture, to give her space, to show her he meant no harm. I didn't see you, he said, voice low, steady. Just came for water. She didn't move. She didn't reply. Her gaze was direct, calm, almost challenging. Not in a hostile way, just unflinching. Her chin lifted slightly, as if to say you saw. Now what? Harlan didn't know what to say next. He wasn't good at talking, not even when it mattered. He felt his skin heat, not because he was ashamed of seeing her, but because he didn't understand what she wanted from him in that moment. She didn't look humiliated. She didn't look scared. And that unsettled him. He turned away, started back toward camp. If she wanted to run, she would. If she wanted to follow, she would. He wasn't going to ask. By the time he reached his fire pit, he could hear her walking behind him, bare feet in the brush, slow and careful. He didn't turn around. He poured water into the bean pot, added more wood to the fire, sat down cross-legged and waited. She appeared 3 minutes later. She stayed just outside the circle of warmth, watching him. Her dress clung to her legs now, damp and worn. One of the shoulder seams was torn halfway down her arm, exposing the curve of her collarbone and upper chest. The edge of the fabric was pinned together with sinew, poorly knotted, like she'd fixed it without a needle. There were scrapes along her elbows and a bruise just below her knee. He didn't ask what happened to her. But he was sure of it now. She'd been cast out, that he nodded to the fire. Sit if you want. She walked over, knelt across from him, and rested on her heels. Harlan handed her a spare tin cup, clean, still warm from rinsing. She held it without drinking. I've got beans and coffee, he said. Not much else. She didn't answer, but she stayed. They sat for nearly 20 minutes in silence, watching the fire rise and settle. The only sound was wind in the branches and the occasional pop from the damp logs. Harlan tried not to stare, but his eyes kept drifting to the way her hands moved. Slow, methodical, like she was trying to stay calm, that he spoke again. You alone? She didn't look at him, but she nodded that he watched her face. Her eyes. There was pain in them, quiet, deep, but buried under layers of discipline. Harlan didn't press. He didn't offer pity. You're welcome to rest here tonight, he said simply. I'll keep the fire going. This time, she looked at him directly. There was something unreadable in her expression. Not gratitude. Something closer to quiet acknowledgement. Like they both understood something the other wasn't saying, that he stood, walked back to his tent, and pulled out a spare canvas sheet. He rigged it between two poles on the opposite side of the fire, just enough to block the wind and give her space. Then he laid out a second blanket and stepped back. She sat down on it slowly, wrapping it around her shoulders. Her legs were tucked up under the dress. She looked warmer now, less guarded. Still, neither of them said a word. That night, Harlan didn't sleep much. He lay on his side inside the tent, watching the firelight flicker against the canvas, listening to her breathing from just beyond the windbreak. Steady, not afraid, that he thought about why she might be out here. How she'd survived this long. If someone had chased her. If someone might still be looking. Then he thought about his own past. The war. The patrols. The times he'd ridden hard through country, just like this, dragging bodies behind pack animals, wondering if the orders he'd followed meant anything anymore. He never got answers, so he stopped asking. Out here, nothing made sense, but at least nothing lied. Just before dawn, she stood up quietly, moved to the fire, and began to repair her dress by firelight. She wasn't hiding herself. The torn neckline dipped lower now, one side slipping open just enough that he caught the soft curve of her chest as she leaned forward. He looked away quickly, not because he was embarrassed, but because he didn't want to take anything she hadn't given. When he looked back, she was still watching him. Calm, quiet, still not afraid. She stayed. The fire burned low. Harlan stirred it with a stick just enough to keep the embers alive without sending sparks too high. The wind was shifting again, coming down from the mountains, colder than the night before. He glanced at her without moving his head. She was asleep now, or close to it. Blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her body turned toward the fire, breathing steady. Her knees were drawn up under the leather of her dress, arms tucked close. Harlan didn't go back inside his tent. He just sat there, arms crossed, watching the darkness beyond the tree line, listening for movement. Not because he expected trouble, but because a man like him didn't stop listening, ever. He didn't know her name yet. She hadn't said a word, but she had stayed. That alone said enough that at first light, she was already up again, kneeling by the river, readying the sinew belt around her waist with slow fingers. She worked deliberately, like someone used to doing things in the cold, used to doing them alone. Harlan stayed back, not wanting to crowd her, just watching from where he stood by the fire pit. He'd seen plenty of Apache women before, in towns, during skirmishes on trade routes. But this was different. She wasn't dressed for travel. No water pouch, no weapons, just the torn dress and the feathers still tucked in her hair. That told him something. She hadn't been planning to be out here this long. When she came back toward camp, she paused beside the fire. Her eyes flicked to the rifle leaning against a log. Harlan saw the glance and read it clearly. She wanted to know if it was meant for her. He picked it up slowly and walked past her, setting it inside the tent flap. She sat down by the fire again without a word. That was the first sign of trust. He handed her another cup of coffee, this time with a bit of ground corn mixed in, thicker, more filling. She sipped it slowly, her hands wrapped tight around the tin, warming them. Harlan watched her in the corners of his vision. There were thin cuts on her palms, small ones, like she'd been digging or clawing through brush. Her fingernails were chipped. The kind of damage you only got for going too long without tools. "How long you been out here?" he asked. She looked at him, eyes steady, then held up both hands. 10 fingers, then 2 more. 12 days. He nodded slowly. 12 days in the high country this time of year, with no coat, no boots, and no fire. That wasn't wandering. That was running. He didn't push for more. Not yet. But later that morning, when she stood up and wandered toward the flat stones near the river, he followed. She was kneeling again, trying to patch the hem of her dress using a sliver of sharpened bone. Her hands were quick but clumsy with the tool. She didn't have proper thread, just a torn leather thong she was trying to split and twist into a crude cord that he crouched nearby. Not touching, just speaking softly. "You need a needle." "I got one." She didn't answer, but she didn't stop him when he stepped into the tent and came back with his roll of kit. Needle, sinew thread, a few strips of canvas. He handed them over without comment, and this time she looked him directly in the eyes. After a long pause, she spoke. Just one word. Her voice was low, rough with disuse. "Taya." That was it. Not a full sentence. Not a thank you. Just her name. He nodded. "Harland." She didn't repeat it. Just gave one slow blink, then went back to sewing.by mid-afternoon. She had repaired most of the worst tears in the dress. She still hadn't asked to stay, and Harland hadn't asked her to leave. That part was settled in the quiet. They both understood that people didn't end up out here unless they had nowhere else to go. Later, while she gathered wood from the tree line, he sat beside the fire, sharpening his knife. He watched the way she moved, cautious, but not fearful. She didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't flinch at sound. Whatever had driven her out, it hadn't broken her. She returned with an armful of sticks, dropped them neatly by the fire, and sat beside him again. Harland finally spoke what had been his mind since she arrived. "They send you out?" She nodded once, slowly. Her jaw tightened. "For what?" She didn't answer at first. Then she reached down and unwrapped a small bundle from the inside of her dress. A piece of carved wood, worn and polished. A totem, roughly shaped like an elder man's face. She dropped it into the fire. Harland watched it burn. No questions. She stared into the flames, her voice coming low, like gravel moving under boots. "I said no." That was all. He understood that he'd seen enough of tribal politics to guess the rest. Some elder had chosen her. She refused. They called it dishonor. And out she went. Taya didn't cry, didn't tremble. She just sat there, watching the carved face blacken and crumble in the coals. That night, after the fire died down, Harland unrolled another blanket and added it to her bedroll without comment. She gave him a long look, then lay down again under the flap he'd rigged up. He didn't speak. He didn't touch her, but when she pulled the blanket higher and turned toward the fire, he caught a small motion out of the corner of his eye. Her hand, reaching slightly behind her, resting near the edge of the blanket between them. Open. Barely. A gesture, not an invitation. Harland stayed where he was, watching the last of the embers fade to black. She hadn't asked for safety. She hadn't begged for help, but she had stayed, and that meant something. When the coyotes called in the hills that night, neither of them stirred. The third day began colder than the rest. A layer of frost had settled across the canvas, clinging to the seams like spilled sugar. Harland woke before first light, as he always did, easing out from beneath his blanket without making a sound. He stood, pulled on his coat, and stepped into the chill. The sky was still black overhead, stars fading at the edges. Taya was asleep under the windbreak, one hand visible above the blanket, fingers curled. She looked peaceful, not warm. Nothing about the desert in late fall was warm, but not restless anymore. She hadn't shifted much in the night. No sudden movements, no gasps or mumbles like before. That told Harland her nerves were settling, that he moved away from the camp with his rifle slung low and a burlap sack over his shoulder. They were almost out of beans. If she was staying, and it was starting to seem like she was, then he'd need to get more than just wood and water. She hadn't asked for anything, but he'd noticed how slowly she chewed now, how often she hesitated before swallowing, like she was saving the flavor in her mouth as long as she could. He spent the morning walking the ridge trail above the river, checking for sign. There were quail, a rabbit or two. He caught one with a snare by the rocks, and another with a shot just before midday. He cleaned them quick, quiet, methodical, his hands moving by memory more than thought. The routine was something that hadn't changed since the war, but by the time he returned to camp, smoke was already drifting from the fire. Taya was sitting by the ring, stoking it with a stick. She didn't look up when he stepped into view, but he could tell she'd heard him long before that. Her ears were sharp. She'd been raised that way that he dropped the burlap sack beside the fire and crouched. She leaned forward and peeked inside. The faintest flicker of a smile passed her face, gone in a breath. But he'd seen it. He cleaned the rabbits again, this time slower, letting her watch if she wanted to learn. She didn't interrupt, didn't interfere, just observed. And when he started laying out the meat on hot stones, she handed him a twig of desert sage from her satchel. She knew how to season it. That told him something else. She hadn't grown up sheltered. She knew how to live out here, even if she hadn't expected to be alone. While the meat cooked, Harlan finally sat down across from her, not in silence this time, but with purpose. "I was in the cavalry," he said plainly, not bragging, just stating fact. Taya looked up, thought he didn't explain further. Just added, "Did 6 years. After that, I scouted. Tracked for officers, survey crews. Saw too many things I didn't want to see. Got tired of men giving orders who didn't bleed for them." He waited, watching her. Taya met his gaze. Quiet, but she understood the weight in his words. The regret. "I left," he continued. "Rode south. Took up trapping. Didn't want to be around people anymore. They asked too many questions." She finally spoke, voice flat but soft. "Why me then?" He paused. He hadn't expected her to speak first. "Didn't plan it," he said honestly. "Didn't mean to see you. But once I did, I figured you looked like someone who wasn't trying to be seen either." Taya didn't answer right away. Then she nodded once, like that made sense to her. When the food was done, they ate slowly. She didn't thank him, and he didn't expect it. It wasn't charity. They were both just feeding what was left of themselves. That afternoon, they worked side by side without ever saying that they would. She fetched water. He mended the tent flap. She scraped old bark from the firewood. He taught her how to tie a better windbreak, using 2 stones and a rope knot. They didn't smile much. They didn't joke, but they moved like 2 people used to surviving. And now, for the first time, not surviving alone. Later, while Taya was down by the river again, washing her hands and rinsing out a strip of hide, Harlan stood near the fire, watching her figure through the brush. He wasn't thinking about her the way he had at first. That initial shock, seeing her exposed by the river, had passed. What he felt now was harder to explain. He respected her. She hadn't begged. She hadn't hidden. She'd shown him something in her eyes that he'd spent years not showing anyone. That night, she handed him the repaired feather she kept in her hair, straightened and tied now, with a loop of leather wrapped at the base. Harlan held it for a second, not sure what it meant. Then she pointed to the tent, then to the windbreak, then back to the feather, not a trade, not a gift. She was saying, "I'm not a burden. I'm part of this now." He nodded, took it seriously, tucked the feather into a notch above the tent's entrance, where the wind couldn't catch it. That night, the fire was warmer, not because of the heat, but because the silence wasn't heavy anymore. They didn't speak, but the quiet wasn't empty. They were no longer just surviving side by side. They were beginning to trust the space between them. The cold snapped harder on the 4th night. A storm had passed through the northern ridgeline 2 days earlier, and now the air behind it pressed low and heavy across the valley like a lid. The kind of cold that worked in a bone. Not sharp, but steady, patient. The kind that didn't go away when the sun came up. Harlan had seen this kind of weather before. Late fall, high desert, elevation over 4,000 feet. It wouldn't snow here, not yet, but frost would thicken. The ground would harden. If they were staying, they'd need more than just warmth. He'd already begun to think that way. If we're staying. 3 weeks ago, that would have been a laugh. Harlan didn't stay anywhere more than a month. He didn't even speak more than a dozen words a day. Not to people, not even to himself. But now there was Taya. Quiet, watchful, close, not dependent, just present. She hadn't said much since the feather, but her body language had changed. Her movements no longer held tension. When she walked around the tent, she didn't look behind her. When she sat near the fire, her knees were closer to his. Still guarded, but not shut off. She was choosing to be near him. That morning, she returned from the river with wet hair, but she didn't towel it dry. She let it hang, loose and shining. It was the first time Harlan had seen her like that in full light. There was a small scar on her left shoulder, thin, pale, not fresh. A knife wound, maybe. He didn't ask, but his eyes lingered a moment longer than they should have. She caught the look that he tensed, expecting her to pull away. But she didn't. She sat beside the fire and began repairing the seams of her dress again, this time sewing new beads onto the cleaned leather with slow, deliberate motions. It was the first time she'd done something for herself that wasn't about survival. Harlan noticed that too. They ate in silence again. Roasted rabbit and dried corn mash. He was rationing carefully now. If the weather turned and they couldn't hunt, they'd need what was left. He made no mention of it aloud, but she understood. She began portioning her meals without him asking, splitting things in half, even thirds if they'd fallen into rhythm. But as the day stretched on, the questions in Harlan's mind didn't leave him. Why had she really stayed? Why him? Why now? And deeper still, the question he hadn't allowed himself to ask in years. Could he let someone stay? That afternoon, while he was cleaning traps, he found an old tin buried near a tree root, a stash he'd forgotten he left last winter. Inside, an oilcloth, half a pouch of chewing tobacco, and a folded paper map. He brought it back to camp and laid it out on a rock beside the fire. Taya looked at it curiously. Used to ride this route, he explained, before I came south. Scout trail between Fort Verde and Payson. River cuts through here, see? He pointed. She leaned closer. There's a canyon up this way, he added. Winter shelter. Natural cover. If this cold keeps up, we might want to think about moving. She didn't respond at first. Then she touched the map. Tapped once, lower down, farther south. A different trail. Harlan paused. You know it. She nodded. Then, in a voice quiet but steady, said, I walked it. 2 days before I saw you. That was the most she'd spoken yet. He sat back. Why come back this way? He asked. Taya was quiet for a while. Then they followed. I turned east to lose them. Found the river. Who? Harlan pressed, softly. Your people. She looked away, jaw tight. Then, not mine anymore. He didn't ask again. But it confirmed what he'd suspected. She hadn't just been exiled. She'd been hunted. He shifted slightly, setting down the map, looking toward the trees. If they were coming after her, someone could still be tracking her trail. But it had been 4 days. No sign of horses. No prints. No smoke. Still, he started leaving false tracks in the brush that evening. Old habits. That night, they sat closer than usual. The wind was bitter, and the fire alone wasn't cutting it. Taya had wrapped herself in one of his thicker blankets, but she was still trembling under it. Harlan could see it in her fingers. She didn't complain, didn't ask that he waited a long time. Then he stood, stepped into the tent, pulled out his bedroll, and laid it beside hers across the windbreak. She watched him quietly. Then she shifted just slightly, so her back was closer to the edge of his blanket. Not touching, not quite that he lay down, arms crossed behind his head, eyes on the stars overhead. He didn't say anything. Minutes passed. Then, in a whisper so quiet he almost missed it, she said, They tried to trade me. Like I was nothing. He didn't turn. He just listened. I wasn't his. I said no. That was enough. More silence to Harlan's throat tightened. He didn't respond with pity. Didn't offer empty words. Instead, he said something he hadn't said in years. You're safe here. She didn't move, but her breath slowed. And for the first time since she'd come to his fire, she fell asleep without her hand resting near the knife tied in her boot. He stayed awake for hours, listening. Not for threats, just to be sure the quiet would last. The next morning, something shifted. Not between them. Between them, things were steadier than they'd been since she arrived, but in the air, in the rhythm of the land around them. Harlan felt it first before he could name it. The birds didn't start singing at first light like usual. The wind, which normally hissed through the brush just before dawn, was dead still. He sat up slowly and glanced at the fire pit. Taya was already awake, not moving, sitting upright in her blanket with her knees pulled up to her chest, Eyes locked toward the ridgeline. She'd felt it too. Harlan didn't ask what she heard. He just stood and moved quietly into his boots, grabbed the Henry rifle, and motioned for her to stay low. She didn't argue that he moved up the slope through brittle grass and dry shrubs, keeping his steps wide and light to avoid crunching frozen soil. His eyes scanned the tree line. Nothing obvious. No smoke. No movement. But still, something wasn't right. His gut was rarely wronged to the crest of the ridge. He crouched low, pulling a rusted spyglass from his coat pocket. He swept it across the valley. Far to the west, maybe a mile or more, he saw it, a disturbance in the low brush. 3 figures on horseback, distant, not coming straight for the river bend, but close enough to raise alarm. One dismounted and walked the trail on foot, inspecting something. The other 2 waited with rifles across their laps. Harlan cursed under his breath and backed away from the ridge. That'd be why the time he reached camp, Taya was already packing. She'd seen the signs in his face before he said a word. Her dress was bundled with the extra food they'd prepared. She held her knife in one hand, blanket slung over her shoulder. Eyes calm, not panicked, but prepared. They're not scouts, Harlan said. Not military. One of them's checking tracks. Could be looking for you. She didn't speak, but she nodded. Harlan looked around camp, calculating. The false trails he'd left would buy them time, but not enough. They had 2 choices: head deeper into the canyon to the east, or south, where Taya had wanted to go days earlier. He looked at her. South, right? She nodded again. They moved within 10 minutes. Quiet, efficient, controlled. No panic. Harlan left the fire pit unbroken on purpose. Let the coals die naturally, so it would look like a camp that had been abandoned days ago. He scattered boot prints in several directions, bent grass reeds to fake movement north, and led Taya through the stream for a quarter mile before they left no sign of their trail behind. They didn't speak for the first hour. When they stopped near a patch of dry mesquite, Harlan handed her the canteen. She took it without hesitation. They sat for a while under the brush, breathing slow, letting their heartbeats settle. That's when she finally spoke. "They're not from my tribe," she said, "but they work for him." Harlan didn't need her to explain who him was. "You sure?" "They came to my brother's tent first," she said. "Told him it was arranged. Told him not to interfere. When I left, they followed." Harlan looked out toward the slope. "You think they'll keep coming?" Taya looked him in the eyes. "He's too proud to let me go." Harlan nodded once. Then he said something that surprised even himself. "Then we don't let him find you." They kept moving after the sun dipped low enough to cast long shadows. Harlan guided her toward a dry wash that hadn't held water in months. It led to a narrow gulch with only one way in and one way out. Not ideal, but defendable if they had to. That night, they didn't light a fire. They shared dried meat and cold beans in silence, their backs against a rock wall. The sky was clear above, stars thick and heavy, and the moon was a sharp crescent above the canyon. Taya leaned back and closed her eyes. Not sleep, just rest. Harlan watched her quietly. Then she said, without opening her eyes, "Why'd you really leave the army?" He hesitated, then answered honestly, "Because I saw men die for things they didn't understand, for land they'd never live on, for flags that didn't care about their names. I figured if I kept going, I'd stop caring too." Taya opened her eyes. "But you do care." He didn't respond. After a while, she shifted her blanket slightly, pulling part of it toward him. A gesture, not an invitation, just a shared line between them, as if saying, "We're in this now, whether we asked for it or not." He didn't move closer, but he didn't move away. They slept sitting up, heads resting near the same cold stone, neither one trusting the night fully, but both beginning to trust what existed between them. That in the morning, they would keep moving, and this time, it would no longer be about hiding. That would be about choosing to walk together. They left the gulch before sunrise, using the faint light to navigate a dry ridge that twisted toward the south trail. The plan was simple: stay high, avoid main passes, move fast when cover allowed, and rest only when needed. Harlan took the lead most of the morning, stopping every 30 minutes to check the ground behind them for movement or fresh sign. So far, nothing. But that didn't mean they weren't being followed. Why mid-morning, they reached a narrow bluff overlooking a basin littered with shale and boulders. It would take time to cross, but once they made it to the other side, there were dozens of shallow ravines where they could disappear for days. Harlan crouched behind a rock, signaling Taya to wait while he scanned the basin with the spyglass. At first, he saw nothing, just brush and dust. Then movement. One rider. Distant. Too far to make out details, but the silhouette was upright, alert, following a path too straight to be random. He lowered the glass and exhaled slowly through his nose. They're coming. Taya didn't flinch. How many? Just one for now, but more likely behind. He glanced at the slope leading down. If we go now, they'll have a clear line of sight. We'll make it halfway before they catch up. Might be better to stop here. Ambush. She didn't hesitate. We stand. Harlan didn't ask again. He trusted her instincts, now like his own. They pulled back behind a high cluster of boulders at the mouth of the basin and waited. The Henry rifle lay across Harlan's knees, loaded and ready. Taya held her knife in one hand, her body pressed flat against the stone, breathing slow. It didn't take long. The first rider came into view. Lean man, long coat, brown hat, rifle across his lap. He was scanning both sides of the basin, not alert like a soldier, but cautious enough. Behind him, two more figures appeared, one with a short barrel carbine, the other leading his second horse. Harlan recognized the second man immediately, scar across the jaw, stiff right leg. A tracker, one of the old Indian fighters the military used when they didn't want to send officers. If he was here, they weren't just looking to bring Taya back. They were looking to make a point that he raised the Henry, lined up the shot on the first rider's chest, finger resting against the trigger guard, breathing steady. Then he hesitated, not because he couldn't do it. He'd made harder shots under worse conditions, but because this wasn't war anymore. This wasn't orders. This was survival, but it was personal now. And Harlan had spent years trying not to become the kind of man who killed without thinking that Taya's hand touched his arm gently. Not pushing, not pulling, just grounding him that he lowered the rifle an inch. Looked at her. She nodded once. Calm. Eyes cleared, he turned back, breathed in, fired. The shot cracked across the basin like a whip. The first rider dropped from the saddle instantly, limp. The second one spun around, drawing his carbine. Harlan fired again, missed by inches. The tracker ducked and scrambled behind his horse. Return fire came fast, sharp, tight. They were trained. Taya slid a rock across the trail, blocking part of their flank, then crawled low behind Harlan's side. You move, he said low. They close, I cover. She shook her head. I stay. No. If they push, I need you to get. Another shot ripped past the stone. Harlan didn't finish the sentence. Taya moved, but not to run. She circled low behind another rock, flanking the nearest shooter. When the third man advanced, rifle low, she rose and threw her knife clean into his thigh. He screamed, dropped to his knees. Harlan took the opening. One final shot, straight through the shoulder of the last man standing. Silence followed. Long, windless silence. Harlan stood slowly. Rifle raised, eyes scanning. All three men were down, two alive, groaning, one dead. No more shots. No more movement. Taya retrieved her knife without blinking. Cleaned the blade on her boot. Harlan watched her. You've done that before, he said. She nodded. My uncle taught me. He trained warriors. I wasn't supposed to learn. He didn't speak for a while. Then he added, saved us. She looked at him, face unreadable. You hesitated. He didn't deny it. I did. She studied him, then finally said, good. That night, they made camp deep in a dry ravine. No fire, just moonlight, and a shared blanket stretched between them like a wall that neither crossed, but both leaned against. Taya cleaned her blade while Harlan wiped down the Henry. The silence wasn't tense, it was tired, earned. After a long while, she said, you left the killing behind. I tried, he replied, but you still did it. He looked at her. You needed me to. She nodded, now what? Harlan leaned back against the rock. We move again. Put miles between us and this valley. There's a canyon further south. Quiet. No trails. If we make it by week's end, we'll be safe. For a while. Taya didn't answer. But when she lay down that night, she moved slightly closer. Just enough for her hand to brush his sleeve that he didn't pull away. They both stared at the stars for a long time. Neither of them said the word home, but for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. The ravine where they camped after the ambush held no echoes. The stones swallowed every sound, and the wind didn't reach the floor. It was safe for now, but the silence wasn't comfort. It was weight. Harlan didn't sleep much that night. Neither did Taya. She curled on her side with the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, facing away from him, but not far. He could see the slow rise and fall of her back in the moonlight, steady but tense. Her knife was still close at hand. Harlan sat upright with his back against the canyon wall, rifle resting across his lap. His jaw ached from being clenched too long. His eyes were dry. The image of the first man dropping from the saddle replayed again and again in his head. Clean shot. Center of mass. Exactly what he aimed for. But it hadn't felt clean that he wasn't proud. He wasn't shaken, exactly, but it had opened something inside he hadn't felt in years. The old guilt. The cold logic of violence, followed by the quiet weight that came after. Taya stirred near dawn. She sat up slowly, wrapping the blanket around her like a shawl, her hair falling forward over her face. She didn't look at him, just stared out into the shadows beyond the rocks. "You okay?" Harlan asked, his voice quiet. She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "I dreamed I was home." He looked over. Her face was still turned away. "I was cooking by the river," she said. "I could smell the bread. I could hear the drums." Then the sound changed. It wasn't drums. It was hooves. And then it all vanished. Harlan didn't speak. He knew better than to interrupt a confession, especially one offered freely. Taya turned her head, finally meeting his eyes. "Do you ever dream of before?" He nodded. "Sometimes I see the men I left behind, the ones I couldn't save, or the ones I had to watch die, knowing it was for nothing." Taya pulled the blanket tighter. "I don't want to go back," she said. "Even if they asked, even if they begged. But sometimes, I miss the sounds, the smell of morning smoke, my mother's laugh." Harlan's throat tightened, not with pity, but recognition. "You don't have to go back," he said, "and you don't have to forget." She nodded once, then stood at BY midday. They'd broken camp and moved again, winding through a narrow canyon path that Harlan knew from old scouting routes. It wasn't used anymore, not by soldiers, not by ranchers. It led south through twisted stone and dry gullies, then opened up into a wide stretch of scrubland backed by high cliffs. They reached it by late afternoon. Taya stopped just beyond the rise and looked out. The place was barren, bleached white rock, no trees, but tucked against the cliff face was a shallow cave, hidden unless you knew where to look. It had dry ground, shelter from wind, and a small spring-fed pool nearby that hadn't dried up even in bad years. Harlan pointed. "That's the spot." They moved down the slope and unpacked in silence. No words, just sheer motion. Tent stakes, canvas, rope knots, firewood stacked. Taya arranged rocks around the mouth of the cave like a soft boundary, marking it as lived in. That evening, after the fire was built low, she took the water pot and gestured to the spring. Harlan nodded, but she didn't leave alone. He stood and walked with her, not beside, but just behind, close enough to make sure, far enough not to crowd. They reached the pool in silence. Taya knelt and dipped the pot, then splashed water over her face, breathing out hard. Harlan turned away, giving her space. But when she stood, dripping, he saw her pause. She reached up, pulled the feather from her hair, and laid it on the rock beside her. Then, slowly, deliberately, she pulled her dress down to the waist and began washing her arms, her neck, her chest. Not hurried, not ashamed. Harlan kept his eyes down at first. Then he looked. She didn't flinch, didn't cover herself. She just met his gaze, calm, open, but he saw the scar on her ribs, another under her breast. He saw the strength in her shoulders, the curve of her hips, the pride in her bearing. She wasn't offering herself. She was showing him that she was whole, that she had survived. Harlan looked away again, but this time it wasn't because he was afraid to see. It was because he didn't want to take anything not given. Taya dressed again in silence, picked up the feather. Reb braided it into her hair. Then they walked back to camp. That night, they ate closer together. No space between them now, just warmth, shared food, and the slow comfort of knowing they had chosen the same direction. Harlan didn't reach for her, and she didn't lean into him. But when the wind picked up, she shifted her blanket enough to cover both of them. That was the first touch to no kiss. No heat, just the quiet press of her leg against his, and a simple fact that she didn't move it away. For the first time in his life, Harlan didn't feel like a man alone in the wild. He felt like part of something living, and that scared him more than the men with rifles ever had. The wind died sometime before morning. When Harlan woke, the blanket still covered both of them, and Taya was still asleep, her hand resting lightly against his forearm. Not possessive, not claiming, just touching. He didn't move. Not for a long time. The fire had gone out, but there was no need to relight it. The sun was coming, and the cave walls were already warming with the first orange light of dawn. He looked at her face. The small lines at the corners of her eyes. The faint scar above her brow. She looked younger in sleep, less guarded. But even in stillness, her muscles were tight, like her body never fully relaxed. Harlan knew that feeling. The kind of readiness you carried after too many close calls. He eased himself up, careful not to wake her. Started walking the perimeter, checking the trail they'd taken the day before. No new prints. No signs of passage. No horses. No shadows on the ridge. Still, he didn't shake the feeling that they weren't done. By the time he came back, Taya was up, kneeling near the fire pit, arranging wood without speaking. She looked at him once, brief, silent, and he nodded. They cooked breakfast slowly, shared the last of the dried rabbit, and boiled some ground roots she'd foraged the day before. The rhythm between them was tighter now, unspoken, comfortable, but not settled. After they ate, Harlan took the Henry and started cleaning it. Taya watched him, then asked, "You think they'll come again?" He didn't lie. "Maybe." Taya nodded, then added something she hadn't said before. "If they do, it won't be 3. Harlan looked up. "4 men left the camp that day," she said. "You saw 3. He felt his gut tighten. "And the 4th? "Tracker. Older. Quiet. Smarter than the others. He didn't follow right away. He waits. Watches. Finds a gap." Harlan lowered the rifle into his lap. "Then we need to move." Taya shook her head. "He'll find us. Doesn't matter where." Harlan stared at her, brow furrowed. "Then what do you want to do?" Taya looked out at the scrubland. Eyes clear. "I want to finish it." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't rage. It was resolve. Harlan felt the weight of that statement settle into his chest. He'd spent years avoiding fights that didn't need to happen. But this one felt like it had already started long before she found the river. He cleaned the rifle the rest of the way, then loaded it slowly. They prepared that day like they meant to stay, not run. Harlan set traps at the canyon entrance. Taya laid thorn clusters in the underbrush. They scouted lines of retreat, found the high ground, and stacked stones for defense. Not a fortress, but enough. By sundown, they were ready. The fire stayed cold that night. No smoke, just the two of them sitting close in the mouth of the cave, waiting. Taya spoke again, quiet, steady. "You still think about leaving?" Harlan thought about that for a long moment. "I used to," he said. "All the time. Anytime someone got close. Towns, camps, even good men. I'd wait until the trail opened, then ride out." Taya nodded. "And now?" He looked at her. "Now, I think, if I leave, it means I've been running from the wrong thing." She studied him for a moment, then reached over and took his hand. They sat like that for hours. Just before dawn, movement came. The 4th man wasn't like the others. He didn't ride in fast. He came on foot, silently, emerging from the ridge like he'd always been there. Harlan saw him first. Gray coat, wide brim hat, flintlock pistol, not a repeater. His steps were light, careful. No wasted motion. He was a killer. Harlan saw it in his posture, in the way his hand hovered near the weapon without ever touching it. He stood in the open, just beyond range, then called out, "I only want the girl. You walk away now, no blood." Harlan stepped out from the cave mouth slowly, rifle held but lowered. She's not going with you. The man didn't raise his voice. I don't need her alive. Taya appeared beside Harland, not behind. Her knife was in hand. Her jaw was clenched, but she didn't shake. The man laughed once dry. She's yours now, then? Think you'll keep her safe forever? Harlan didn't answer that. He lifted the Henry, sighted the ridge. The man moved first, fast. Smart, but not smart enough. The shot echoed across the basin, point one clean strike. When the dust settled, the man lay still. Taya didn't flinch. She didn't run to the body. She didn't say a word. She just turned to Harland and exhaled slowly. Her shoulders lowered for the first time in days. It's done, she said. He nodded. She stepped close, laid her head against his chest. And for the first time since the day he left the army, Harlan Tate didn't think about where he'd go next. He was already there. The fourth man's body stayed where it fell for 2 full days. Harlan didn't touch it. Neither did Taya. There was no need. Coyotes would come eventually, and the desert would take the rest. That's how it worked out here. Things returned to the ground that birthed them. They didn't talk much that first day. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the need to say anything had finally passed. Taya collected dry brush from the slope above the cave and boiled water for stew. Harlan checked the traps near the ridge, but didn't reset them. There was no threat left. That night, they built a fire for the first time in 3 days. Not for survival, just warmth. It burned low and clean. Taya sat beside Harlan, her shoulder resting against his. They ate slowly. No tension, no hurry. That it felt like breathing for the first time. The days that followed brought a rhythm again. Only this time it was intentional. They weren't just surviving now. They were building something. Harlan started reinforcing the cave entrance with logs and packed dirt, creating a crude door frame. Not a fort, not a prison, just a home. Taya began shaping clay pots from the red mud by the spring. She dried them slowly in the sun, smoothed the surfaces with river stones. She didn't talk while she worked, but when Harlan passed by, she'd always glance up and meet his eyes. That was enough. They learned each other's habits in silence. He always cleaned his rifle in the morning. She always braided her hair before dusk. He liked to stand watch after dinner. She slept with one hand under her blanket, never beneath it. They didn't ask why. They just knew. One evening, a dust storm rolled in from the north. The sky turned the color of old copper, and the air carried grit that stung the skin. They pulled everything inside, wood, gear, food, and sealed the cave as best they could. For hours, the wind howled. Inside, with the fire banked low and the entrance blocked, they sat facing each other, knees touching. Harlan looked at her for a long time, then said, I never thought I'd come this far south and find anything worth staying for. Taya didn't smile, but her eyes softened. You didn't find it, she said. You made it. He nodded once. With you. A beat passed. Then she asked, do you still feel like you have to leave someday? Harlan exhaled. The question hit deeper than she probably knew. He shook his head. No, she studied him, as if waiting to hear more. Yes, oh, he gave her more. I was always chasing something. Orders, freedom, some version of peace. Thought if I just stayed alone long enough, I'd find it. But I didn't understand what peace really was. It's not the silence. It's not the distance. It's choosing to stay even when you have a reason to run. Taya leaned forward and touched his face. Light, steady, her thumb brushing the line of his jaw. Then she kissed him, slow. Certain, not desperate. Harlan didn't move at first. Not because he was unsure, but because for the first time in decades, he wasn't afraid of being seen. All of him. The quiet, the guilt, the scars. She saw it all and stayed. When they pulled apart, he laid his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. The storm passed by morning. Weeks turned to a month. They built a smoke rack for drying meat. Gathered more stones for a wind wall. Taya planted yucca near the waterline. Harlan strung a wire snare farther out on the trail. Not because he expected danger, but because old habits don't vanish. They settled. One day, a mule wandered into the ravine, lost from a ranch farther north. Harlan caught it gently, tied it off near the spring. We could trade it, he said. Taya was quiet. Then, or we could keep it. He nodded. Oh, they did. In time. She gave him a small leather pouch she'd sewn from her old dress scraps. Inside was the burned fragment of the wooden totem she'd once thrown into the fire. "This is the last thing I carry from them," she said. He took it, held it carefully, then placed it on the shelf they'd carved into the cave wall, between the dried meat and the fire flint. "We don't have to forget," he told her. "No," she said. "Just move forward." That night, they lay beside the fire, blankets pushed aside in the warmth. She turned to him, eyes open. "This is enough," she said, "even if nothing else comes." Harland wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. "It's more than I ever thought I'd have. No gunfire, and oh horses, and oh fear. Just two people under one sky, in the place they chose, with no one left to take it from them."